Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on supporting worker organising. It's great to have so many people attending today. Before I introduce myself, I just wanted to let everybody know that there is translation available, as our speakers will use English, Bahasa Indonesian, and Thai today. The translation tool is the globe symbol at the bottom of your screen, or if you can't see it there, it might be found in the More section at the bottom of your screen as well. Please also note that this webinar will be recorded today. So, my name is Sarah Mount, and here at Freedom Fund, I work on a program along with my Freedom Fund colleagues and Humanity United to address forced labour and labour exploitation in the seafood sector in the Asia Pacific. As part of our program strategy, we have a key pillar that focuses on strengthening worker power. Under this element, we have supported organisations across the Asia Pacific, including many in Thailand and in Indonesia. We have it as a key pillar of our strategy as we realise, like I know many of you do here on the webinar today, that workers are best placed to monitor their own conditions and raise concerns when they arise. They are there in the workplace, they know what's happening, they know what the solutions or changes are that they want to see. If they're able to come together, they can connect, support each other, and strategize together. They can negotiate for better conditions and advocate for change. If better conditions are obtained at the outset, it can protect against labour exploitation and forced labour later down the road. So we know that worker organising is important to support, but we also recognise that there are many challenges. There's hostility to worker organising by both governments and industry. It can be long and difficult work to organise workers. Workers may be spread far and wide geographically. They may face retaliation for organising. Workers are also obviously working and they need to find the time to come together. And there's the fact that many local organisations that are trying to support worker organising, they're completely stretched. They don't have much time or resources to plan and strategise and organise. And in the seafood and fishing sector, things can be even more complex. The sector includes both fishers who work at sea and workers on land that process and pack seafood. For fishers, fishing vessels might be out at sea for a long time without access to communication. When vessels do come into port, it may be very far away from where they started or in a different country altogether. And there can be many stakeholders involved that influence workers' working conditions, like recruitment agencies, captains, managers, and owners. So, as we embarked on working more in Indonesia and noting the huge importance of supporting worker organising, but also recognising challenges, we commissioned the University of Sydney to undertake some research into labour organising in the seafood sector in Indonesia to help us understand better some of the basics of labour organising and how it's different to other strategies, understand the unique role of different organisations, of unions, worker associations, and NGOs, and the different approaches undertaken, learn some lessons from other sectors in Indonesia, and importantly, understand how we can support our local partners in this area and how can we improve our own strategy. That research, led by Professor Michelle Ford, is really excellent. I encourage everyone to read it if you haven't already. And Michelle will kick off our webinar today, highlighting key findings and recommendations of the research. Then my colleague Ari will facilitate a discussion between Anon Hibarang, the General Chair of Sakti Salute, a fishing and seafood workers union in Indonesia, and Suchart Trakunhatip from the Migrant Assistance Program Foundation in Thailand. That discussion will focus on the practical reality of worker organising in Indonesia and Thailand to hear more about how each organisation does worker organising, what are the challenges they encounter, what are the positive outcomes they've obtained, and what they would like international organizations and donors to do more of or know more about to strengthen support of worker organizing. We will hopefully have about 15 minutes for Q&A after the discussion today, so please put forward questions using the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Now, let me formally introduce Professor Michelle Ford. Professor Ford teaches Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on topics related to labour activism and work. Her current research projects focus on Myanmar's garment industry, Indonesia's commercial fishing industry, and gender-based violence in Cambodia's construction industry. Michelle is the author of Workers and Intellectuals, NGOs, Trade Unions, and the Indonesian Labour Movement, co-author of Labour and Politics in Indonesia, and lead author on the report Labour Rights in Indonesia's Seafood Sector. Handing it over to you now, Michelle.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you all today. We're going to look at just some of the elements of the written report. The report is much longer and more comprehensive, so I echo Sarah's comments that it's worth having a look. But today I'm going to focus specifically on a discussion of organising versus servicing and advocacy, look at some contextual factors in Indonesia, and then look at the current lay of the land. So thinking first about the differences between organising, servicing and advocacy, these are three approaches that are very important in labour movements around the world, but they're quite different approaches. And it's very important also to understand the difference between them and how they come together. So as you can see on the screen, organising involves the recruitment of workers into an existing organisation or forming a new one. And it implies a commitment to making space for workers to contribute to their collective formulation of their priorities and strategies, and to equip members to engage in collective advocacy for those priorities and strategies. It's by far the most challenging of the three strategies, and this is something that is often lost when we talk about them. And because it is the most challenging, it also takes the longest, it's the most resource intensive, and so on. Servicing, by contrast, involves the provision of workers of different sorts of support for workers, for example, legal aid, emergency shelter, or even access to benefits negotiated as part of a bargaining process, as is the case with unions. Another element of servicing is education and training, which may serve different purposes. For example, providing professional skills, information about labour rights, or strategies for running a democratic workers' organisation. Historically, in Indonesia, many labour NGOs engaged in servicing activities in sectors where unions were weak or simply not present. However, unions also can engage in servicing, either targeting their own members or a broader cohort of workers. And in some cases, servicing work can be used to promote organising, but in and of itself, it does not constitute organising. Though, as I said before, many organisations, both unions and NGOs, tend to confuse the two. The third strategy is advocacy, or what the Freedom Fund describes as influencing, which involves knowledge production and dissemination through campaigns to bring about change in international norms, government policy, or public opinion. Advocacy initiatives may be sustained, but they may also be sporadic and incidental. For example, publicising particular cases in which workers have experienced abuse. In best case scenarios, advocacy campaigns can lead to substantive changes in policy or approach, as illustrated by some of the international campaigns on responsible seafood production. However, their success varies very much on the capacity of organisations to create networks, mobilise public opinion, and leverage strategic connections. It's also important to note here that these three strategies can be combined. They can be employed separately, but also together. For example, direct forms of service provision, such as case management of disputes around pay or working conditions, are extremely resource intensive for unions and may be difficult to sustain if they're not tied to policy advocacy or the recruitment of union members. They may also be applied by one strategy. These strategies may also be applied by an organisation or by a network. For example, an advocacy campaign promoting freedom of association may be run by a coalition of unions and labour NGOs, or a union hotline may direct distressed workers to an NGO-run counselling service. Just before I get into the details of the Indonesian case, I'd like to make a couple of remarks about the method. As Sarah indicated, the Southeast Asia Centre was commissioned to do this research, and we conducted it in 2022 and 2023 primarily. And this involved interviews at the national level, but also field observations of approximately 3 weeks per field site in a range of different ports with government officials, employer associations and unions. 4 of these ports were designated fishing ports, and the 5th was a general port that serves as a fishing port in Bali. And you can see here that we spoke to a number of people from civil society, employers and government, but also a significant number of fishers. What's not on this table is also the seafood processing workers we spoke to, and that was about the same number of fishers as are on this table. And just to give you a sense of where we worked, the field sites, 3 of them were on Java. One was in North Jakarta. And as you may know, Jakarta is the capital of Indonesia. There was one in East Java, Banyuwangi. The Benoa port is in Denpasar. And then you can see we have Bitung, where Pa Arnon and Ari are currently on the top tip of Sulawesi, and then a 5th port in Ambon. And we selected these ports because they had very different characteristics. North Jakarta and Bitung, and to some extent Benoa, are very big internationally oriented ports, whereas the ports in Ambon and Banyuwangi are much smaller, though Ambon, because of its position near near Papua, where many of the fishing, the richest fishing areas are, is an important port because of its regional location. Okay, so before I was talking about organising, servicing and advocacy, and I just wanted to provide some more examples of how these play out with the different groups that Freedom Fund is working with. Let's start with seafood processing workers, who are most like other industrial workers in Indonesia. They work in a factory on the whole. Even though they're said to be seasonal, many of them work in the same workplace for a very long time. And therefore, in many ways, they're an obvious target for organising work. And an example of that organising work would be something like convincing seafood processing workers to establish or join a union or an informal workers association, and use that structure to fight collectively for their rights of interest. And that's really the difference about organising. It involves workers working together for their interests rather than being the target of work about their interests. Servicing might be, for example, providing legal aid to workers who've been dismissed without cause, and we found examples of this in a number of places. And advocacy might involve lobbying the government to increase factory inspections. For fishers within Indonesia, it's quite similar. Organising would be convincing them to join or establish a union, but the location of those unions is much more complicated because, as we know, fishers work at sea much of the time. They're very mobile. They're often on relatively small vessels that only, even quite a big boat may only have a small crew. And that structure of employment is very important. That said, there's obvious opportunities in Indonesia, for example, organising at a port level. We're bringing together fishers from different boats when they're coming in and out of the same port. An example of servicing might be helping a small scale fishers to establish a cooperative, and advocacy might be lobbying companies to sign up to a certification scheme. For migrant fishers, it's even more complicated because, of course, they work outside of Indonesia's national boundaries. And there is some interesting work going on to support migrant fishers, but ultimately it's much more difficult in many ways because the national industrial relations system that governs their work is not the one where they are citizens. An example of servicing might be supporting migrant fishers' families while their relatives are overseas. An example of advocacy might be establishing a social media campaign that draws attention to their plight. Let's move now and talk about some contextual factors. And the first relates to the demographic characteristics of the cohort we interviewed. So most of the seafood processing workers we interviewed were women, not all, and they had very low education level, and they were from a range of ages. And they had decided to work in the seafood processing factories because they were convenient, they were often close to home, but also because they had few other options because of their geographical location and their education levels. The issues they brought up most often were long hours, and their work was often considered secondary. So even if their husband was unemployed, they often described their work as supporting the work of their husband rather than as being the breadwinner for the family. For fishers within Indonesia, they were all men, and they also had very low to low levels of education. They tended to be a little older than, for example, the migrant fishers. Again, they had few other options, and some of them came from long lines of fishing families, but this was not always the case. And the issues they brought up most often were debt, length of time away, the difficulty of returning, but also uncertain access to universal health insurance in Indonesia. For the migrant fishers, they were a little more educated, and often they were making a really conscious choice to work overseas because it did offer better money. And the fishers we spoke to who had worked on both local and international vessels said without exception that the conditions on the local vessels were worse than the conditions on the international vessels. And I think for donors in particular, this is a very important point to be aware of. The issues they raised were very similar to the issues raised by domestic fishers. In terms of employment status, and this is important because your rights as a worker often depends on the nature of your status. As I mentioned before, a lot of the seafood processing workers were actually daily workers or quote unquote seasonal workers, and yet they had worked in the same factories for up to a decade or more, especially the older women. So this really creates issues in Indonesia about whether they have rights to access leave requirements, long service requirements, and also disputes resolution. In terms of workplace relations, they worked in medium to large factories, and so they were subjected to the manpower law. But as I mentioned, their seasonal and daily status did reduce their rights under that law. But importantly, very few mainstream unions are active in the sector, and those that are find it very challenging to create a situation where workers' rights are really supported. Amongst the workers themselves, they weren't very interested in organising, and part of this is because of their self-perceived secondary status as supports to their husband's income stream. But there's also a widespread sense that any job is better than no job, and they were reluctant to rock the boat. For fishers within Indonesia, the ones on larger vessels are meant to have a sea-based employment contract, but profit sharing is actually still very prominent. And again, this has implications for their status under the manpower law, but also fishers are regulated under the Ministry for Marine and Fisheries as well. So the trouble is with that, there are these conflicting jurisdictions. And one of the interesting findings of both the Freedom Fund work we've done in our broader research is that conflict between manpower and marine affairs and fisheries creates gaps where fishers really aren't looked after very well. The people we were looking at were working ideally on large fishing fleets. We're still on the previous slide, Basha. But they're also on individual boats. And the larger fleets should be more open to being regulated, but in fact, there wasn't so much difference. Also amongst this group, there was a low level of interest in organising, a sense of a lack of agency. And also, as I mentioned before, they were very highly physically mobile, but also they changed employers a lot. And often if conditions were too bad, local fishers vote with their feet. They move to a different boat. In terms of migrant fishers, they require a collective bargaining agreement by law with a manning agent. But that manning agent isn't the ultimate employer, and also the collective bargaining agreements in place are very much administrative requirements rather than collectively bargained agreements. And this is a major flaw in the current situation in Indonesia. They work on foreign boats, and so they're subject to Indonesian and foreign legislation. And in some situations, for example, a case where Indonesian fishers were on a boat in New Zealand, the fact that they were subject to the foreign legislation meant they got a much better deal. But often that is not the case. And then the final thing to note here is in terms of organising, the requirement that they be subject to a CBA means that there's an incentive for them to join an organisation, quote unquote, but this is not the same as being active in an organisation or being represented by that organisation. So in terms of organising, it's more, again, an administrative requirement rather than a real form of organising. So when we think about these particular conditions and their implications for organising, there are two major points I'd like to underscore here. First is that different strategies are required for the different constituencies. And there is considerable potential, I think, for organising amongst seafood processing workers and local fishers in Indonesia. Migrant fishers, the focus of organising is different, but it is still important. However, organising needs to be very carefully thought out and needs to take a long-term approach. Community-based organising can be helpful, but it's different from the current village-based approach. So at the moment, many of the small organisations active in this field are organising the villages from where migrant fishers originate, and a lot of their support is in the pre-departure stage or for the families left behind. And this is great work, but it does not constitute organising work. The ultimate aim of organising work should be to establish a presence in particular ports for local fishers or particular factories for processing workers so that they can bargain collectively. In my final minutes, I'd like to talk briefly about the current organising landscape. As Sarah mentioned, there are both NGOs, informal worker associations, but also unions in this space. And these organisational forms have different strengths and weaknesses. And as you can see from this table, NGOs' strengths lie in their ability to communicate with policymakers, their broader context, understanding of the broader context, and their financial resources and flexibility. There are many characteristics that are shared by associations and unions, so particularly understanding worker issues and understanding the lived experience of those issues, but also the ability to act collectively. But unions have a special position in industrial relations systems because they are the formally recognised representative of workers at the local and the national level. In terms of the current strategies, and I've alluded to many of these limitations as I've gone along. Next slide, please, Basha. The seafood sector is basically ignored by the mainstream unions. The industry-focused unions are not engaged, and seafarer unions are not that interested in fishers, and migrant fisher associations are not that interested in local fishers. At the moment, many of the Freedom Fund's hotspots partners spend a lot of their time and effort in advocacy and servicing. And as I said, this is valid and important work, but it is not organising. And really, we need to focus more on workplace organising if we are to break through on these issues. And finally, in terms of strategies to maximise change, as I've underlined before, advocacy and servicing are important, but supporting workers to organise is ultimately the most important, successful way to achieve long-term grassroots-driven change. And we're going to hear from a Thai colleague shortly, but there is some evidence from Thailand that it is possible to organise really vulnerable constituencies in these sectors. In the Indonesian context should actually be easier, but at the same time, there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, myself, for the very insightful summary. My name is Ari. I'm the program advisor of Indonesia Seafood Hotspot. And let me introduce the two speakers we have today. I have with me Anon Hiboran. He is from Lembe Island of Bitung City, Indonesia. He spent 16 years as working as a migrant fishing vessels on international vessels. During his time, he was facing numerous challenges, including long working hours, inadequate living conditions, and difficulties in accessing legal justice. In fact, at one point, he was on the sea for nearly 2 years. And in 2020, he, drawing from his experience, he co-founded the Serikat Awak Kapal Perikanan Bersatu, or SAKTI, the United Fishing Vessel Cruise Union in North Sulawesi. And he is the general chair. In 2022, he helped establishing Srikandi. It's the women's wing of SAKTI, which they aim to advance the status of women in the fishing industry. And this is actually the first independent women union in the fishery sector in Indonesia. I'll now introduce our second speaker, Suchart Rakun Hutip. He from Thailand. He began his career as a volunteer teacher in rural northern Thailand after earning his bachelor's degree in law. He then focused on promoting work organizing and trade unions at Lampun Industrial Estate in northern Thailand. For over nearly 2 decades, Suchard has established trade unions in garment, jewelry, and electronic industries in Thailand. Since 2010, he has been working on collective work and mobilizing migrant workers to advocate for collective rights. Suchard also has supported workers in Mysore on the Thailand-Myanmar border in submitting petitions to improve working conditions. Despite Thai laws that prohibiting migrants from forming trade unions, more than 10 factories have complied with this workers' demand. Suchard currently work with MAP Foundation as a labor rights project coordinator. So welcome to the two speakers. I would like now to explore how this works on the ground. I think I'll start with Arnon. I'll ask questions in English because you already have the questions. The first one, can you tell us maybe one or two different ways you do work organizing in Sakti Sulut? And then after that, I'll go to Suchard to talk about his experience with MAP Foundation. Please, Arnold.
Baik, selamat malam.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening. Well, there are several ways. Apologies, the speaker is muted. Strategy in organizing. Especially for processing seafood. So our strategy is to establish Srikandi. So Srikandi is a platform for female workers who work in the food processing industry, because in North Sulawesi, especially in Bitung City, 80% of the workers in the seafood processing 80% of them work in the food processing industry, so they are facing a lot of issues. The female workers face a lot of issues, and some companies even employ minors. So our strategies one of which is to establish Srikandi to protect the rights of female workers and to eradicate child workers in the seafood processing industry. So our expectation when we establish Srikandi is that the protection could be from the upstream area until the downstream area. Those who are working in the vessel and also in the processing factories. And one of the strategies to formulate this is by being engaged in the tripartite cooperation with the government. So we discuss issues in the fishery sector. So we are able to know what the issues are to create a good and also safe industrial relationship, especially in North Sulawesi. And we also proposed to have a wage council so that female workers in the processing industry and also the domestic workers can have good wages.
I'll go to Suchard for the same question, Suchard. Please. Suchard, you're still on mute. Yes. You're still muted, Suchard. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah, please.
Good evening from Thailand. In relation to MAP, we are working on organizing with migrant workers from Myanmar. Their issue is most of them, they are not entitled to the benefits under law. And the most important thing is they cannot organize trade unions. They can be members, but they cannot manage, they cannot administer trade unions. From my experience in working in this area, I call the organizing process as process using 5 steps. And the top one is creating change. The first step is learning, getting to know with local workers in the areas we are working in. We talk with them, we meet them and talk with them. We try to create friendship. We talk with them about issues so that they can tell us about their concerns. We can give them more rights. We educate them about this. The second step, during activities will allow us to learn that some migrant workers are ready to be leaderships, to persuade their peers to fight to protect their rights using collective actions. This is recruitment. This process is recruitment of leaders so that we can work collectively. The third step is capacity building. Capacity building, we divide it into 2 parts using the concept of leadership and membership. We use the theory of fried egg. In the middle, it is the egg yolk. It is the leaders we will build the capacity. The capacity building is more intense. And the second layer is egg white, which is the members or workers who are interested in organizing. We will build their capacity. We give them content, and there are more broad issues. It is the topics for them are different from the leaders. Okay, this is what we do in terms of promotion. Mainly, we would like to allow them to have understanding, to be aware of the situations, and we want them to identify solutions, and we would like them to understand how to work on organizing to some extent so that they can work with workers in the factories or in their own areas. The fourth step, expanding of membership base and the base of workers so that they have more power. It involves expansion of the number of people who are interested to create change. And this step takes some time. It involves diverse activities to work with workers in a factory on an area so that they have understanding and participate. And the last step, which we expect to see, which is change, making change, which is the last step, to allow workers in the plant in an area to have better quality of life through petition and negotiations with employers to reach agreements on employment conditions which are better for workers, and engagement or participation are very important, which will allow for negotiation. We use this approach to do organizing in our area. That is.
Thank you so much, Suchat. That's very interesting experience you're sharing there. I'm now going to Arnon. So Arnon, what has been your key challenges in work organizing at Sakti Solo?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So the challenges that we are always facing, first, workers are still afraid of joining a union or being a member of an organization due to intimidation from companies. Yeah, the companies forbid them to join a union. Second of all, the workers who are engaged in membership, it is hard for us to provide training on guidelines or maybe on legal regulations because they have limited time. They are busy with their work. As third, so the government doesn't really side with the workers. The fourth one, companies are not open on how to establish bipartite in the companies or joint cooperation agreement or PKB to solve issues issues on the rights in the companies. Thank you.
Um, I'm now going to back to you, Suchar. I want to listen. Despite the challenges that you have been, you might have faced in your work, what do you think are the main achievements that you have been, achieved through the work organizing? Suchar?
Thank you. Working on organizing. Actually, there are a lot of challenges involved, but I would like to pick 3 main challenges, which I think main challenges and constraints or limitations to the work we do in the local areas. The first challenge is the policy of employment in Thailand, which the policy for employment of migrant workers, it involves a lot of issues. The first issue is permission of employment for short time, 3 months per 1 year contract. This is an obstacle, a key obstacle to do organizing, because once if they form a group, if they have leaders, and after that the contract expires, their contract will not be renewed, then their status will expire. The employee status will expire based on the law. This is a key challenge which we have encountered. In some factories, and worker leaders have an issue. Some of them, are prosecuted. Their case in the court, and some employment contracts are not renewed because the law allows for short-term employment, and their contract is not renewed. And the second challenge, which I think important for organizing of workers, which is retaliation of entrepreneurs, of the operators of the establishments. Non-violent, even non-violent, they keep eye, they monitor, they give warning, they change, they rotate, they transfer their jobs. This is not severe. And as for severe retaliation, they dismiss leaders, they dismiss members. A few companies, they use severe methods, and the cases are in the court. And sometimes when workers form a group, they negotiate and they have a better condition. And those companies close the factories to stop employment, and they set up a company, a plant in another area, and they hire migrant workers. A few companies have this issue, so we need to provide assistance in terms of living of workers and help them with finding a new job. We help them with cases because the prosecution is done against the employers. We help them in terms of cases. And the third key challenge is the fact that Thailand does not allow migrant workers to organize or set up trade unions. This is another key challenge. The fact, although our work can allow them to set up trade union, to do negotiation and have that structure, but it is a lack of stability has an impact on the workers. You can see discontinuity because they don't have their own organization. These are key challenges which I think interesting given the previous situation. As for achievements, the first achievement is the workers, at least workers from 7 or 8 plants, they can organize the trade union and they can submit their request based on the law, under the law on labor relations. They ask for they make a request to get better employment conditions, and we found that they got better employment conditions. Some of them get better pay, they get more benefits, welfare, better housing, they have better environment, PPE, a better equipment. And some companies, some workers in some companies, they ask the employers to help to pay contribution for a card, not sure insurance card or not, in method, not through the MOU scheme. And the employers pay 50% for the card, not sure insurance health card or what. And the second achievement, which we think can lead to some changes in relation to the protection of the rights from the request, from the action, it leads to employee committee that comes from the election of the voting of employees. An employee committee plays a key role in relation to the rights and benefits of workers, and the employee committee is protected under law to, if employers, before they penalize them, give them warning, they must ask for permission from the labor court. It has an impact on the organizing of workers, and they can keep leaders. They can protect leaders from being dismissed. This can allow for the faith in organizing. This can strengthen the group, and this can lead to stability of the group. That is from us, from me.
Thank you so much, Tat and Arnon. That's very interesting insights you're sharing here. I think I'll go now to the Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A feature that you can see down there. I just received a question about let me check what I have here. Oh, I don't. Yeah, let me check what's the question I received from audience. The first question, I think I'll go with all the three. Maybe you can start briefly from Michelle and then Arnold and then Richard. The question is, in places where it's hard to form unions, what are the other approaches or alternatives for workers to organize themselves? Can you get that question, Michelle?
Yes, so the question is about alternatives in places where it's difficult to organise. I mean, if we look back to Indonesia's own labour history, we can see lots of examples where community-based organising, not in the village sense currently used among fishers in Indonesia, but around workplaces, was a very successful tactic where workplaces were hostile to unions. So what happened was labour NGOs worked with groups of workers and really gave them the skills and the knowledge that they needed, but also the belief that they could organise and that they could do something in the workplace. And so when Indonesia became democratic in 1998, there were these groups of workers in major industrial centres or who had those skills and who very quickly moved into the mainstream workplaces. And the unions in them. The other thing that was done at that stage was quite often they worked with members of the official union and they called them guerrilla workers. So what they would do is they would identify people who had a bit of fire in their belly and they would approach them informally outside of the formal structures and again equip them so that when the time came they could play an important role in the independent unions in the post-Suharto period. Where I think it's different for fishers and seafood workers is compared to that time, even though these workplaces are very hostile, they are less hostile than the workplaces faced by those worker activists in 1998. That said, if you rush in with only 1 or 2 people on board, or even 10 or 15, it's very easy for a boss, an employer, to find reasons to sack activists. So it's very much about building strength so that once you do declare in a workplace, you have sufficient power to stand up to efforts to attack you. And I think something that Anon has done very well in North Sulawesi is he has built relationships with government officials. And although they may not always do what the workers want, at least there's pathways to communication that are not just about talking to the employers, but also talking to other people who are stakeholders in the process.
Thank you, Michelle. I think you have you give like a very expansive explanation to this question. So I'll go to this question too, and then I'll start. This time I'll start with Suchar. You talk about retaliations against worker activists. Can you explain how do you, in your experience, how to minimize that kind of risk? Can you get me, Suchar?
Yes, I get your question. There are 2 parts. The first part is as a person working in the field area, okay, there is a risk of retaliation from the workers, of the employers, and even the industrial federation. Maybe they threaten us, but we have measures for protection of ourselves and our staff. The second part is in case of retaliation from the factories or plants or establishments. First, we need to address immediate issues. We need to deal with persecution. This is the first thing we can do. This is how we address immediate issue. The second part, which is the most important thing, which can ensure understanding between workers using the right of collective action and negotiation to protect their rights. We support forums for sharing, for talking. It is a forum of the network. It involves workers, government authorities, and industrial federation and work employers and NGOs and civil society organizations. They join this forum. They talk with each other about issues related to rights and making requests, negotiation, and organizing. And I think this forum will lead to the creation of understanding of employers. This can create understanding among authorities. Some of them disagree with organizing of workers, this can create understanding, and this can allow organizing and negotiation possible under law without violent retaliation, but focusing on talking or dialogues. We have organized these forums on the periodic basis, mostly once 3 months. And I think the network forum will create understanding. This can stop retaliation and the consequence. We have seen some we can see some results, and yeah, the retaliation is less, and this they can have dialogues, they can have negotiation instead of using harsh measures. Thank you. That is.
Thank you, Suchar. I think I'll go to Anon now. Yeah, same question for you, Anon. So in your experience in North Sulawesi, how do you deal with such retaliation?
Yes, thank you very much. Retaliation related to what employers do to the workers. Retaliation here is how we prioritize the rights of workers, yeah, namely social dialogues. If they are not accepted, then we can do some movement. In this case, we keep engaging stakeholders and also the government, especially the workers union or the supervisory board, worker supervisory board of North Sulawesi. We can discuss the retaliation carried out by the employers with them.
Have the third question here about do you have any suggestions how funders can balance the need for funding and ensuring that worker organizations are sustainable in the long term and decisions are made by membership? I think I'll go to Michelle first for this question.
Okay, this is the $64 million question, because the experience of the labour movement more broadly in Indonesia shows two things. It shows that sometimes outside funding can be very problematic for organisations because it can create a culture of dependency and actually create a disincentive for organising work. On the other hand, even the unions who have been best at organising at the grassroots level, if your members are earning a very small amount of money, it's very difficult to get enough money through dues to develop innovative programs. So you might be able to provide enough money to run your office, to do the basics, but without external support in the medium term, actually, it's very difficult to continue the challenging work of actually not just getting workers together, but getting to a situation where you can negotiate with employers.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you respond to that briefly, Suchar? Like in 1 minute?
I think organizing is not easy. Yeah, it takes time. Funders should understand this, and this involves a lot of activities. I mean, funders, donors should wait. It doesn't mean that they want to support for a year and they expect to see organizing in a short time. We need to establish understanding with them that organizing takes time. It is a changing of ideas, and support should be a long-term support to allow groups, organized group, to be strong and grow and support themselves in the future. Funding should not be short-term funding and with expectation of something in the short term. This is what we would like to this is a message we want to convey to the funders.
Anon, can you respond to this same question about how do you see in relation to balancing between funding and also independence of the union?
So in this regard, the workers' union is really needed, yeah, to improve the capacity or for capacity building for the members in this matter. It is how the donors help with strategic work for the interest of this labor union, or maybe encourage the tripartite collaboration between the government,
Thank you.
the labor
I
union,
think
and
we
also the
are
workers.
coming to the end of our session today, and I would like to ask you about one question, I think, to close up. Looking back to our insightful discussions today, what do you think is the most important thing for international actors? There are many of them here in the audience that they need to keep in mind when supporting work organizing. 1 minute for you, Michelle.
I think the message probably came through loud and clear in my presentation that for funders as well as for groups on the ground, it's actually much easier to support servicing and advocacy than to support organising. Organising is difficult, it's long-term, and it's uncertain because unless you've got champions who really do know what they're doing, and again, I'll point to Anon because I think he is achieving this in Indonesia, you can spend a lot of money and nothing can happen. So I think it's really about working with local partners, understanding not just the opportunities as local partners see them though, but also pushing them to see maybe some different opportunities, thinking about their context differently, learning from international examples and supporting that work not just on a 3-year cycle or a 5-year cycle, but on the sorts of cycles that actually allow for real change.
Thank you, Michelle. Arnold, do you want to respond to the
Ya.
last question?
Perjuangan itu masih panjang
Yes, the fight is not
dalam
over.
hal untuk memerdekakan
Still
buruh
a
khususnya
long
di
way to
sektor
go, yeah.
perikanan.
Especially
Bagaimana
for
kita selalu
workers in the
menerapkan
fishery sector.
memanusiakan
We need to
manusia
humanize
lainnya. Mungkin itu, Pak.
other humans.
Thank you
That's
so much.
the bottom line. Thank you.
Suchar?
ครับผมสำหรับผมเนี่ยผมมองว่างานจัด
For
ตั้งเป็น
me,
พื้น
I think organizing is the basic thing. It's the most fundamental thing for the protection of the rights of workers. If they cannot organize, if they cannot be empowered, right protection, call for rights and call for benefits for better quality of life is impossible. So organizing is the most fundamental thing. And one important thing is creation of understanding of the power of collective action and organizing, and they can grow and sustain themselves. They will make their group grow, but it must come from understanding that organizing and forming a group is their way out for their rights. Okay, at first they can get funding to form to make their group grow, and finally they will use their own funds, they will use their resources to strengthen their group.
Thank you. I think we are coming to the end, and I would like to extend my gratitude to our esteemed panelists today for their insightful sharing here today, and also for giving a more understanding about the promising approach, challenges, and lesson learned on labor organizing. And of course, I also want to express my gratitude to all of you, our audience here, for your active participations and thoughtful engagement today. The recording will be made available to those who cannot join the webinar. And I think my colleague has shared the link to the report. And yeah, you can access that for more details about what we discussed today. So thank you again for the great conversation today.